Hello, everyone who is watching us on YouTube, Facebook, and Vkontakte. My name is Larissa, and I am the producer at Strelka Institute. I would like to welcome Victoria Camblin and Nicholas Korody in our Strelka 2020 live public program. Victoria Camblin is an executive editor at 032C, writer and a curator of public programming focusing on contemporary culture. Nicholas Korody is a writer, designer, and founder of a research-based practice called Interior Agency. Victoria and Nicholas will look back on the Black Hole catalog issue published in 032 magazine in the late 2019 in order to consider its theoretical implications within a contemporary context. The talk will be followed by a Q&A session, so please do not hesitate to post your questions on YouTube, Facebook, or Contact chat, and I will pass them to our speakers. The event is held in English with a simultaneous translation into Russian. Russian version is available at Strelka page in Vkontakte and Facebook. So here we go.
I am preparing for a worldwide pandemic. Go, 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 go. Before I was prepared for pandemic, I was probably spending 20 hours a day worrying about it. When the pandemic comes, those who are prepared will survive. Those who do not prepare will die.
A pandemic is a virus or disease that infects large numbers of people in multiple countries.
A pandemic can happen in a matter of hours. If someone on one side of the country had the disease and they flew across the country, by the time they get to the other side, people are taking it home, they're taking it to work.
A 2010 study suggests that the risk of disease transmission during transcontinental flights is high, making it possible for one sick person to cause simultaneous outbreaks in multiple geographic locations.
I am most afraid of the flu because it's so common that people don't really take it seriously, and that has killed thousands and thousands and thousands of people.
The World Health Organization believes that a devastating influenza pandemic is almost inevitable. Even conservative estimates suggest as many as 100 million people worldwide may be infected, and millions will die.
My worst fear is that I would somehow contract the pandemic. We've been outside, so let's make sure that we are clean, okay? And bring it home to my family, and then have one of my family members die. Sorry, that really got me. Now I have to stop. I need bouffant caps. I want 2,000. No. I want 3,000.
The flu is transmitted through droplets in the air, meaning catching a deadly virus can be as simple as being on the wrong end of a sneeze.
Okay. How soon can you get those to me? Maybe.
So Donna has stockpiled thousands of protective masks and gloves in her garage.
I put together kits that have everything you would need to survive a pandemic. In my kits, I have isolation gowns, antiviral tissues, exam gloves, N95 mask, foot covers, heavy-duty sanitizer, goggles, stearamine, antibacterial wipes, and hair covers.
When an influenza pandemic outbreak occurs, the CDC estimates that it could last for up to 8 weeks.
Hello, I'm Nicholas Korody. I'm a designer and writer currently based in Los Angeles. Alongside Joanna Kloppenberg, I'm the co-founder of Adjustments Agency, an experimental architecture studio, or as we call it, an architecture of architecture studio. I'm also the founder of an interiors agency, which I like to conceive of or just to think of as a interior decorating studio, although perhaps in a different way than most, as I'll hopefully demonstrate in a second. My work explores the constant formation, collision, and deterioration of multiple interiors at a range of scales and temporalities. Much of it deals with the political economy of housework, and in particular decorating, as a labor and spatial practice, but I also investigate other forms of interiority, like, for example, an individual's psychology or the production of a national domestic imaginary by a state. Similarly, I'm interested in conceiving of the planet as a form as an interior that's either new or newly noticed, delineated by walls, which could be understood as the multiplying claustrophobia-inducing catastrophes of the present, from global heating to sea level rise to wildlife extinction. That's the foundation of the Black Hole Catalog, which is the subject of our conversation today, where interiority is understood as a sort of economy of scales ranging from the psychic to the planetary. My co-author Victoria will tell you a bit more about the background of the project and its context, which was the 37th issue of O32C magazine.
Thanks, Nick. I'm Victoria Camblin. I'm the executive editor of 032C magazine, which was founded in 2000. So we're celebrating our 20th anniversary this year. I've worked there. I've had some connection to the magazine since 2006. Ever since its founding, the magazine has sort of been structured around themes. So the first issues were monothematic, and then that grew into these monothematic cover dossiers, which the Black Hole Catalog is the most recent of. So the function of these dossiers is manifold. So sometimes they're highlighting some kind of archival find and giving it new importance. Sometimes they're canonizing something. Sometimes they serve to present research, and typically we'll develop that research into a thesis. Sometimes they also can be a little bit predictive, we've noticed in the past. And sometimes they sort of crystallize a sentiment, either simply around what we've been thinking of in the office and as a team, or kind of a global sentiment. The idea sort of being to create a thesis or sometimes hijack one from other industries. So this one came to us after I was in dialogue with Nick for about a year. And we had been talking about various architectural, industrial kind of themes, also interiors, modes of consumption. And he let me know that he'd been working on this concept called the Black Hole Catalog, and it just fit seamlessly into the framework of our cover dossiers as a place for, as I say, presenting research and also sort of reformulating or bringing themes together in a new way that seems resonant not only to the work we do at 032C in terms of covering contemporary culture, criticizing it, and also making it, but also it fit, even simply given its environmental outlook, within a discourse that was happening at 032C in our fashion department, where we make 032C apparel and ready-to-wear clothing. And we were talking quite a bit about sustainability and modes of production and ecological, ethical production modes, and also within fashion at large, which was really taken over, I would say, in 2019 and since, by a discourse of sustainability, which was absolutely what dominated the conversations around fashion weeks right up until before the COVID lockdown. So through February 2020. So that provided sort of an existing conversation in a way for us to tie this work in. And now I'm going to just jump straight in to the actual dossier, if you wouldn't mind playing the video. This is the trailer we created to present the dossier sort of as an overview.
I wanted to panic. I wanted to act as if the house was on fire.
Anxiety defines the contemporary experience. Young people in particular are terrified, and the CBD, benzos, and mindfulness apps are not soothing anymore. We can scream fire and call for help, but we cannot evacuate when the burning house is planet Earth. Certainly not now, probably not ever. We're stuck inside, even when we're out striking. Everything you do has environmental consequences, and yet nothing you do seems to make a difference. Traditional images don't adequately represent this world, the usual blueprints and drawings can't outline it, an accepted aesthetic convention won't enhance it. We propose a new how-to, a new catalog of tools. We propose a manual for the new interior.
Thank you. So that presents the dossier and corresponds to the introduction, but it also brings out some terms that are important to the way we structure things as a magazine. We refer to what we're proposing here as a manual, which is an important part of how we talk about ourselves, and essentially sort of describes how we use cultural materials that we're covering as tools and how we compile them. And similarly, the video flags up how traditional images are used and calls for a new image system. And one thing that we do at 032C is really question what media and cultural production in general are putting out there in terms of what we consume and how things are branded and how things are communicated and how that affects how we talk about things and ultimately how we think about things and how we live. So one function of that is that we're always looking at other magazines and what they do. It's sort of a way that we get to know ourselves and also kind of critically approach the processes, how language and images are used together. And so we're often going back into the archive to old magazines, as well as new and contemporary ones, and sort of looking at what they did and what they represented culturally and what their impact was. And a major influence for us and for many magazines and content producers today is something called the Whole Earth Catalog. The Whole Earth Catalog was founded in 1968 by Stuart Brand, who was in the Bay Area at the time, and it was produced out of San Francisco, California. And it was a real sort of groundbreaker in terms of the way we look at content. It is essentially credited for sort of being a predecessor of the internet, and I'll explain how that works. So Stuart Brand was a biologist who studied at Stanford, and in the early 60s, he would drive around in a truck, and he called it the Whole Earth Truck Shop, and he would sell tools out of it, so objects he thought that would be useful to people. And he also had with him a catalog, meaning a list of items that listed things that did not fit into the truck, so larger tools and all these things that he thought would be useful. So already here we have this use of the word catalog and the use of an object that is a catalog, not just in a sense of sort of archiving something like a library catalog, but also in the sense of acquisition and building. Stuart Brand, while he was doing this sort of mobile sales operation, he also in the mid-60s, 1966, had campaigned NASA to release what was then just a rumored satellite photo of the whole Earth. This is the very famous photograph of the Earth there, round and bright in this black sky that's very familiar. Here we've added this atlas figure. He viewed that image as symbolic of global unity, of human adaptive strategies, of shared experience, and I think to a degree of our relative insignificance individually versus the whole. And so already we see Stuart Brand has ambitions to use tools like the ones he's sharing in his truck, and frankly, like this image, quite ambitiously to either make things as an agent, so grinding flour or building your own lawnmower, but also to change society, to change industry, and to change the way we think about ecology and our planet. So he's successful with this campaign for the NASA image, and he goes to a designer in San Francisco called Jay Baldwin, who was known to have sort of a catalog fetish. He was just reading catalogs very often as a designer. And Stuart Brand had heard this, and he approached him to make this whole Earth catalog coming out of this whole Earth truck shop discourse, where anyone, anywhere, to paraphrase Brandt, on Earth could dial a number and find out anything about anything. So you have this catalog framework, which of course is commercial, and you also now have an information framework. And in the video that we played initially, which is from a 2012 episode of a television show called Doomsday Preppers, Donna, the woman who was prepping for what she viewed as an imminent pandemic by calling people on the phone and ordering things from this catalog, which is exactly what is described in this sort of Stuart Brand interaction about the genesis of the whole Earth catalog. So obviously, having all sorts of useful information all in one place, not relating to any particular topic, simply being useful, is very much the same ideology as the internet. It really describes and sketches out not only the function of Google, where you can look up all this information anytime, it also describes Amazon, where you have this capacity to simply order just about anything, any tool you might need. So eventually this catalog comes out, and it's designed very functionally, and it features this image of the whole Earth on it. And it's very, very articulate in terms of what it's setting out to do. So it's taking these ideals of ecology that are symbolized by the whole Earth image, of unity, and so on. But interestingly, it really binds them up with self-sufficiency, with personal power. That's a word it actually uses in the opening statement, and with individualism, and also self-education. So this is in 1968, which of course is a very famous year globally for civil rights and for student movements. And it really sort of differs from that discourse. It's really not about the government giving you what you need or protecting the citizens and so forth that you have, for example, from the European left in the 60s. It's really about this idea of doing it yourself. And it's very kind of representative of this quite American sort of Anglo-Saxon view of what freedom and what efficiency and proper living really look like. So it unites this language of sort of common human experience with this goal of very, very radically individualistic lifestyle and production, which one might argue is not a particularly big worldview. Also, in its endeavor to also provide tools, which tend to be information, other publications, so reading lists and books and academic journals and independent publication projects, also courses and classes that you could sign up for or take, sometimes maps and statistics. It's really mixed, again, sort of in a way that mirrors the internet. It's not, theoretically, it's not curated. As long as it's useful, it can go in there. Of course, the community out of which it came from was not a particularly global one. It's white men in Northern California, so to a sense, it's curated with a certain bias, I would think. And it became quite an institution in Northern California in the 60s and early 70s. Steve Jobs has referred to it as a Bible, and himself, Steve Jobs, has referred to it as Google before Google started. And even quoted in a commencement speech, the quote we saw on the previous slide, which is "Stay hungry, stay foolish," which we sort of problematized by adding "in this economy." And that was a reference to what was supposedly the final issue of the Whole Earth catalog, which came out in 1974. However, it kind of maintained a presence, particularly in the Bay Area, where they had a store, sort of a supply goods store, but also would publish sporadically well into the 90s. And it would kind of use those later publications sort of as adaptations. So they would do software reviews where software wouldn't have been a thing that you reviewed in 1968. But I will say even the earliest PCs and synthesizers and these types of developments were addressed. So they were also not just coming from this really earthy sort of type of self-sufficiency. They're also looking at the latest technology, and they really did have their finger on the pulse. And of course, being in the Bay Area, they were also proximate to so much research and development that was happening in technology as well. So as they begin to pull back in the 70s, Stuart Brandt actually sort of began to pivot. He remembered this community theme and sort of noted that given the language and the kind of planetary visual direction here, that the perspective presented in the Whole Earth Catalog, which was a bit too anthropocentric, but already by this time they see themselves to have basically finished their project. They've made enough catalogs by 1974 that they're able to call it explicitly that it's over, even if they did continue to produce here and there. And also by that time, what we have generated through this discourse and really through this image that Brandt brought into the public sphere is the look and the visual language of an entire ecological movement. So every sort of foundation or organization or movement that has to do with environmental preservation and so forth really looks to this kind of global rhetoric and global visuals to signal the importance of preserving our environment and so forth, and again to kind of unify this idea of humanity. And the motifs are always sort of these planetary visuals, also the colors of green and blue that you see, and here you really have the image of the whole earth functioning as a tool to market an ethos, even if the ethos that it's marketing is not really aligned with the individualistic pre-Silicon Valley practices that really would be found by the community behind the Whole Earth Catalog. So we've already sort of stepped into a world of contradictions, and we were feeling back in late 2019 when this dossier came out that and in its development throughout that year, that the image was insufficient. And at that time, of course, I mentioned the 1968 protests before. There was a sense of global unity coming together around the climate strike movements. The face of those movements was Greta Thunberg. And so we noted also this sort of shift in the way people talked about climate change, the way they talked about ecology, the way they talked about the global crisis. And suddenly it was not this handholdy, hippie version of the whole earth that we had been sold and that had been capitalized upon for decades already. What it was this face of Greta, famously very angry and very afraid. So we had this new outlook, and we had this new tension around it, and we had sort of followed that into this way of asking for new imagery as well. In the dossier originally, we predicted that even if Elon Musk of SpaceX could get a rocket, could get astronauts into space, that there would be so much trash around it that he wouldn't actually be able to get through it and get anywhere. You would crash or you'd have to turn around. And that was something that people were talking about last year, was this idea of like how hugely polluted not just our planet is, but the immediate surroundings of our planet as well, and space in general. And also the sort of way we clinged to this space mythology, the imagery of it, and of course we hadn't. The United States at that time had not sent anyone to space for a while, so we were operating sort of quite metaphorically and quite theoretically around that discussion of actual space travel. But what's pertinent here that I want to flag up is that Elon Musk of SpaceX, which is a private company with various partnerships, including one with NASA, did send somebody into space, two people, in fact, last month. And so you'd think, okay, well, that's exciting. Can we come together around this global moment? And even in the live stream from SpaceX and NASA, which they collaborated on, they referred to this little window in the space shuttle where the astronauts, once they made it out into space, would be able to look back at the Earth, just as this image conjures this sort of moment of looking back and feeling this love and smallness and all the things you're supposed to feel when you look and contemplate the Earth on its actual scales. This kind of idea of unity that you imagine. That SpaceX launch was supposed to happen on May 27th. It was postponed due to weather. And so the live stream sort of ended with this quite anticlimactic moment of them just saying, we're going to try it again in a few days. The way that it failed kind of also conveys an atmosphere of failure around the imagery that we were thinking about. Also on May 27th was the day that it was 2 days after the murder of George Floyd, and it was the day that famously the AutoZone windows were broken in Minneapolis, which has started a new sort of wave of protests and protest documentation. People actually began to start things on fire. So that's just one incidence of one of the metaphors we've used in this dossier, kind of actualizing in a very literal way in the time since we conceived it, and where we are now. The other thing I will say about this space imagery is that when SpaceX and NASA were discussing the project, and right up in the live stream, all the way up to the rocket launch, the dominant discourse was about how wonderful it is that we're now sending commerce into space, how wonderful it is that a private organization, not a country, not NASA, is launching things into space and bringing with it privatization and bringing with it capitalism. And there was a sort of, obviously we were quite over the imagery already, but there was a sort of moment of, oh God, it's even if we get through the space junk, which we speculated would trap us, we're still trapped in the exact same system, the exact same discourse, and the exact same presentation of ideas. And so the black hole was our initial means, and I think still stands as our way of embodying that sense of not being able to escape. So this, in a black hole, all paths bring you closer to the center, and you can't get out anymore. And seemingly, even if we leave Earth, we've still got this identical structure of capitalism and also of tech and 20th century commerce that we have here on our planet. So on that note, I'm going to pass it over to Nick, who will go a bit more into the whole, as it were.
Thanks, Victoria. So as Victoria was saying, around the time of when we were starting to really kind of, or actually about like a year before we had started putting together the dossier, this image, or the original image, this is a kind of manipulated one, which superimposes the Earth beneath the black hole. But this famous image of the black hole emerged. It was the first representation. It's an image. It's not a photograph. It's not actually like an impression captured on photographic medium. It's rather the kind of result of massive computations, and that was really kind of heralded at the time. This was in May last year, and it circulated widely, this image of the black hole. And one of the things that happened was almost immediately its circulation became untethered from the kind of scientific remarkability of the event, of this kind of unprecedented imaging of what is really kind of an impossible object to image. And it really is an impressive scientific feat that was performed. But it started to be shared really widely. It became a meme quickly, we could say. It went viral. And as it was circulated, what was interesting was what we thought was interesting was how the meme became a kind of metonym, or became a kind of the metonym became mimetic. It served as a kind of proxy for all kinds of, I guess what you could say, the contemporary fields, the way in which the present moment is so much defined by an effective structure of panic, anxiety, fear, shame, guilt, etc. All these things sort of kind of just got attached as image. People would tweet about it, and then maybe compare it to like an X or a tagged photo, and how it was kind of disappointing in how it looked. It wasn't as cool as the sci-fi version. We became very interested in tracking and looking at how it was circulated. So when we were discussing kind of how could we image ecology in a way that was beyond the limitations, so the kind of whole Earth image, as Victoria was saying, was in many ways its kind of signifying capacity has been frozen. It signifies an understanding of ecology based on this notion of planetary brotherhood. Brotherhood being, a term that Brand used, and which also does kind of in its genderedness is kind of specific, we might say. What could be a kind of possible alternative image for our ecological present? One of the things that's interesting is the black hole in many ways corresponds more closely to how we image the world right now. We don't go into space on except for Elon Musk the other day. We rarely, and haven't for quite some time, gone to space to photograph the Earth. And when we go to space, it's not to photograph the Earth. It's for a host of other reasons as kind of an accidental byproduct. When we image the Earth today, we're doing so using computational processes very similar to the one that produced the original black hole image. That's how we understand global heating. That's how we understand biodiversity loss, etc. So on one level, it kind of more accurately represents the Earth as we understand it. But then we also got interested in how it became this kind of effective condenser, this kind of narrative machine and magnet, where it could host, and it had this it has this capacity to kind of hold all kinds of signifiers and semantic structures that the other image just can't do. So in a way, we were quite interested in how, despite being billions of miles away and posing absolutely no real threat to the Earth, and certainly not humans on the Earth, not within the kind of time span of human life, nevertheless, the black hole felt somehow closer to the world we're living on this planet than the whole Earth did. And for us, we were interested in kind of tracking that shift. As I mentioned before, we began the project conceiving of it in the sense of a kind of construction of an interior, a space that is sticky, that is like when you're inside in the space, you have no vantage point from outside. And that seems to us a very apt description of what it means to live in the contemporary ecological moment. There's no real ability to step outside of it. No matter where you look, you're always embedded within it. It has a sticky logic. We phrased this as the new interior. We coined it, and after our talk, we're going to kind of return to the two terms here and kind of hold them, put them under scrutiny. But our concept was welcome to the new interior, or how to feel at home in a house on fire. Again, Greta is kind of constantly speaking of the house we inhabit, the planet as a house, and that house on fire. In that sense, as an interior of the contemporary, it not only describes this planetary enclosure, the kind of actual limits of the stratosphere, of an atmosphere that is warming, of a planet shrouded in space debris, but also an interior state that could be described as the kind of a collectively held individual state, or aspects of our interior state which are shared amongst us. We conceived of the new interior in the sense it's not only a ontological state, but a psychological one. And these two different registers are actually feeding into each other within a kind of complex economy. So if the crisis-ridden planet is a new interior, the new interior within us is also participating in that. And I could kind of illustrate that by when you have fear of the future, it pumps cortisone into your veins. If you get depressed by the sense that your future has been depleted, your dopamine is depleted as well. So you take more drugs, then you piss out those drugs, and your piss toxifies the ocean and kills dolphins. We're quite literally trapped in this kind of endless reverberating cycle. We make the new interior, but the new interior also makes us. And for us, what was quite interesting about that was that it then positions us in a way as all designers. Design becomes a kind of universal occupation, even if nobody's actually getting paid for it, or very few of us are, even real ones. That operates on the level where even how you shit, the way you shit, where you shit, has ecological impacts. It reverberates in kind of countless ways and acts as a kind of as a design element in ways that are probably more dramatic than many, let's say, street furnitures. Switching to the next image. I think, as is quite clear right now, obviously, several months into the global COVID pandemic, this new context, this new interior is making us sick, and not only on a psychological level. COVID was in many ways unleashed because of wildlife decimation and the destruction of their of wildlife habitats. But before that was happening, we were already getting sick. We were already being radiated. Tumors were growing. We were inhaling pollutants and developing respiratory illnesses. Those two things conjoin and build off of this kind of psychological distress, which is in particular kind of manifesting within the younger generation, within Zoomers, within Gen Z, who have kind of unprecedented rates of depression and anxiety. In the dossier, we term this ecophobia, which is actually it's a psychological term that is in use by some practitioners to describe kind of fear of ecological catastrophe. Previously, it was used in diagnostic manuals in a much more literal sense, in the sense of its Greek etymological roots. Phobia, of course, meaning fear. Eco, which comes from oikos, which is the shared root of ecology and economy. Ecology being this, it means a home. Oikos means a home. Ecology would be the study of the home, and economy would be its management. In probably the last 5 years or so, the term has been kind of refashioned by psychiatrists, again, to apply to climate-related distress. It's, in that sense, it can be understood, in the original sense, it could be understood as kind of a reverse of agoraphobia. So if agoraphobia is traditionally understood as kind of a reaction to a traumatic event that occurs outside of the home that makes you fearful of ever leaving the home for fear of the traumatic event happening again, ecophobia is the kind of initial primary trauma is within the home, and so the home becomes a trigger. In the kind of contemporary ecological reuse of the term, a kind of similar architectural logic is still at play, and could be kind of read on a series of different registers. The first would be perhaps that it's the emotional state produced by realizing that there is no outside of the home, that the interior is again planetary. It could also be understood as the feeling that the home is turned against us, which is a trope of horror movies, of horror literature, going back to Edgar Allan Poe, to H.P. Lovecraft, with the rats coming out of the walls. It's the sense that the house has become animated with malice towards its inhabitants and is taking its revenge. And no matter how many kind of cleaning fluids we use, the pests will still overtake us. And in fact, they often exacerbate it, as we know. On a third level, it might be said to be kind of the realization that it was in fact us who turned against the home a long time ago, that we've been chipping away at the foundations, and at this point we no longer have a shelter to speak of. Our galaxy brain level interpretation is that ecophobia is a sense of fear or anxiety produced by the realization that we are our home, that there's no real operable distinction between us and our context. And so when our context is being deteriorated, then so will we. As a result, ecophobia is a very debilitating condition. It's often paralyzing. Young people today often talk about being unable to get out of bed because of it. It even can prove lethal in certain cases. And in that sense, going back to the Whole Earth catalog, if the kind of protagonist of that, as Victoria was mentioning, was very much a kind of white male living in the Bay Area, kind of upright, like independent, outdoorsy man, the protagonist of the Black Hole catalog, which I'll get to in a second, the kind of prospect of it, is much more of like a prone body, a body that's receptive, a body that is affected. It might be a body in bed from depression, or it might be a body that has been rendered forced to be in bed because of the debilitating and deleterious effects of the new interior. One of the kind of primary affects of it, or effects of it, is that it makes all of our plans seem incredibly stupid. And that comes down to the fact that, unlike other phobias, ecophobia is rational. Most phobias are treated through a kind of relationship between the analyst and the analysand, where there's a kind of convincing of the irrationality of the phobia, or that's a strategy. With ecophobia, that's incredibly difficult to do because, in fact, it's us. I mean, it's things like this right now. It's talking in a kind of lecture when we have 10 years left to decarbonize, that is in fact the irrational gesture. Everything that we're doing, every kind of maintenance of the status quo and kind of day-to-day normality is a kind of irrational gesture. So in the face of that, it becomes very difficult to imagine the possibility of a treatment, let alone a cure. Really, the kind of only possibility, in the sense that it is a real phobia, egophobia can be understood as a kind of failure of the ego to make sense of kind of a new agent within a context. This new agent is perceived as a threat to the ego. In that sense, egophobia, a potential cure or potential treatment we venture, would be that it requires the kind of individual to come to terms to kind of negotiate with the estrangement and alienating effects of this new interior, of the new context in which we inhabit. Echoing other aspects of my work, which I mentioned in the introduction, one of the ways that we tried to kind of to envision this was through the metaphor of decorating. If you're homesick and you just moved into like a new sublet, as I did, in fact, one of the first things you probably do to make yourself feel at home is first de-decorate, take off their materials, and then redecorate. You're not about to tear down a wall. You're not about to kind of build an extension. In fact, you're probably not even going to paint. All the modifications are going to be surface. They're going to be about reusing what is existing, was already existing. And then kind of translating that into a kind of political, ecological metaphor, we position decorating as a way of operating in a world in which we are all inadvertent designers, but we don't want to build. We have resource scarcity, and we don't want to do any more lasting damage than what we've already done. It's kind of a claim that rearranging is a kind of more operable action within the new interior compared with construction. This brings us to the actual catalog, the Black Hole catalog, where we replace the whole Earth image, the first image of the Earth, with the first image of the black hole. And subtitled as you can see. As Victoria was saying, that one of the kind of preoccupations as we were engaging with the original material of the Whole Earth catalog was in confronting this strange use of the catalog, this hybrid between index and kind of sales device. And in many ways, the kind of legacy of the Whole Earth catalog, it's become so heroicized, it's become so kind of mythologized, that we forget that it really was a sales catalog. You really could just call up these numbers and buy things from it. It was a way of buying freedom in effect. And in essence, if you kind of ignore its crunchy granola vibe, the Whole Earth catalog was not very far off from an IKEA catalog. And just like with an IKEA catalog, when you actually order something, you might imagine that not only are you going to have a new apartment, and you're probably going to be a new you. You're going to actually use that writing desk, rather than work in your bed. But then when it arrives, it ends up being a bunch of shitty pressed fake wood, particle board, that you kind of like bundled in a bunch of styrofoam peanuts, which will never deteriorate, which will last much longer than you or humans. And then all of a sudden you realize that you can't find the last fucking bolt and you panic. We wanted to do something different with the Black Hole catalog while maintaining the catalog as a kind of specific media platform, or media format. We were interested in thinking of the idea of a catalog as always selling a world and promising you the means to enact that world. But we wanted to kind of scramble the kind of coherence with which that promise is made. We'll go through some of the different things that we were technically selling. The majority of them are free in the catalog. They're links. It's both updated for the internet and kind of strangely made, as you'll see in the design of it, made strangely anachronistic. One of the things that we were interested in a catalog is that it feels kind of unlisted. It has that proto-Google feel of discovery, of just kind of a wealth of information that you can piece together, but then also has this slightly curated element. So we wanted to, again, kind of maintain a balance between the two. One might read our position, and I would kind of caution against it. It was not what we intended, as being a kind of all opinions are okay position, or a kind of a blanket free speechism, because there are competing ideologies which we index in our kind of in the catalog collection. However, it was more of our intention. One of the things that kind of I found when I first arrived at O32C, one of the kind of constant conversations had is that they trust the readers very much, and so we were interested in playing with what juxtaposition and collage could do in a very kind of traditional sense. So with that, I think I'll just go straight into the actual catalog pages, and maybe Victoria can join me again, and we can pull out some of the elements that we have going on here. This is one of the first pages. I'll start off where you can see there's quite practical things, a list of places not to move, but also an activated charcoal facial mask, a way of donating your CPU to science. One of the kind of, each of these things kind of like elements we saw as kind of like loaded with a kind of variety of positions one might take in relation to the new context of the new interior as we describe it. It's something that, again, is both an individual experience that kind of is wrapped up within a logic of self-care, but it's also one of complete contingency in opposition to that of like the original Whole Earth catalog of ferocious independence. I'll pass it off to Victoria. I don't know if she wants to.
Just to look at some of these moments on this particular spread where you have where not to move. Of course, that dialogue in recent months became about COVID statistics, not about sea level rise or climate events. And similarly, this sort of really prevalent self-care dialogue, or discourse, I should say, that sort of proliferates on social media and so forth, and that has its own problematics, also kind of really came into the foreground when everyone began to isolate at home and suddenly went really full on with these practices like face masks and also DIY home projects, doing exercises in your living room, all of these types of sort of really individualistic things that you can do that sort of count as self-care, self-development that happen on this home scale. That just really, when we look at this now, there's a whole new sort of aesthetic implication to a face mask or to anything really made at the home. Do we want to maybe go?
Yeah, just going off that really quickly, one of the things about like the donating your CPU to science that we were discussing was this idea of like the way in which at the time of producing this, science was a kind of contested authority, and how quickly that shifted within the last 4 months to a kind of reclamation where almost like the idea of donating your CPU to science is almost kind of like a kind of tithe that almost has a kind of religiosity to it, that like science is the kind of good capital F father that one should like be in kind of a almost religious relation to. But let me skip forward. Just to point to a couple other ones, how to mine a computer for gold. We started to think about like how are the kind of normal objects that we use to interface with the present, how could we kind of strange them, weird them, and look at them as kind of more as useful objects in other ways, we might say.
And these also play on various stereotypical fears too around that we have around the objects and tools that we use generally. So you had something in the last spread about cell phone usage and health, which is of course also in the discourse at the moment with 5G. That's a kind of popular conspiracy theory for COVID times. And so yes, while providing these tools or cataloging them, and you'll see at the bottom of every one there's a web address which indicates where they were sourced. So these are all found. The catalog is both useful but also sort of perhaps stokes some existing concerns or some anxieties that are a product of the particular sort of psychological moment that is ecophobic.
Right. We also, I'll linger on this slide maybe as the last one before we kind of wrap up this section, is we were, again, quite interested in being kind of almost obvious in some of our intentions and then more sly with others. Juxtaposition became a kind of primary tactic through which we could kind of secrete specific narratives, while at the same time maintaining the capacity of it to function as a catalog of tools that allows the reader to construct their own narrative. So much of what we're trying to do is say that we need new narratives again for this new context, and these are potential elements that you can use to construct your own specific one, whether that's, you know, whether or not you believe Bill Gates can save the world through his philanthropy, or whether or not you think his head should be on a guillotine. We also kind of were interested in, again, the sense of like a kind of overwhelming feeling of existing within a kind of capitalist market economy, a global capitalist economy, in which, in the kind of final plug of our catalog, we have the collected works of Marx, Engels for 3,000, which is the most expensive listing we have in our catalog. But you also have all of their works on the opposite page listed for free. Maybe on that note, because I think our time is maybe going faster than we imagined, to kind of circle back to our initial conversation, one thing that we're quite interested in right now or today, and hopefully in the conversation we have afterwards, is when we were approached with this talk, one of the kind of rationales was this strange predictive quality that seemed present in the catalog, in the Black Hole catalog as a project, and the notion of the new interior, when only 5 months later, it turned literal, and all of a sudden to stay home became a signal. It became a political responsibility. To be political meant to stay home for at least a few months. But I want to kind of now, before we open it up to questions, to put the two terms as before to sort of them under pressure a bit. When the metaphor of the new interior turned literal and everyone was forced to go inside, one of the things that kind of struck out was how, you know, what we're doing in many ways by constructing this notion of the new interior is presenting a kind of new universal, even if it's a very kind of loose one. But I think what we saw with the kind of literalization of interiority is that the interior as a space is hardly a universal kind of, kind of universal space, or let's say possession or property, or thing that one has access to. One of the kind of most dramatic aspects, I think, as looking back on this, and again, these are just notes that hopefully we can talk about later in the conversation, but one of the kind of most kind of dramatic aspects of global governmental responses to the pandemic was the kind of assertion of a kind of uniform response in how people can live. So everyone was told to stay home. Obviously, that was impossible. All of a sudden, we saw the kind of emerging into mass culture of this distinction between a quote unquote essential worker and a non-essential worker. Essential workers, who, at least in the United States, are typically marginalized and typically racialized. Who counts as it is usually a racialized category, essential worker. Were expected to expose their bodies and their lives to greater risk than anyone else. Meanwhile, everyone else was told, if you were not an essential worker, to stay home, kind of as if everyone was a freelance designer and could kind of support themselves off of a laptop and a Wi-Fi connection. Of course, that's not true or tenable. And we're seeing the ramifications of that, I think, globally, of that kind of 4 months of mass unemployment and ever increasing precarity, while a certain segment of our population is exposed to a deadly disease at higher rates. So this generalized flattening exposes a kind of series of internal contradictions, which I think one could say are both embedded within the construct of the new interior, but also interiority as a kind of retreatable space. You see massive increases of domestic assault globally as people are forced to stay inside with their abusers. You see multi-family homes, which again are typically occupied by immigrant families, are again not able to socially distance in the same ways, and then are criminalized for it, either kind of socially condemned or quite literally criminalized for it. And then, of course, you have the fact that the home as a kind of idea of a retreat, of a refuge, has never been a kind of a real thing, a real place for a huge segment of the population. And I can only really speak to my particular American perspective in this. But if you look quite literally at like the legal protection of the home as a space of refuge, which is a common law precept known as the Castle Doctrine, it was never designed to be applied to Black people. And in the United States, since Black people were forcibly brought to the United States by slavers, that the home was in fact always the inviolable white home was kind of juxtaposed with the always open home of the Black enslaved person. The kind of protogenitors of the police force in the United States, which were slave patrols, would regularly terrorize the residences of enslaved people. And that extends all the way into the present today, where SWAT teams or police with no-knock warrants will intrude on Black homes at rates far higher than they will to white homes or homes owned by white people. In that sense, I mean, you saw during the midst of the COVID pandemic, Breonna Taylor was murdered in her own bedroom precisely through one of these no-knock raids. So what does it mean to force people to stay inside if the inside is a place where they can be murdered by a police force? One of the kind of other dramatic aspects, I think, of this flattening effect, this flattening that somehow highlights existing stratifications and divisions, was for those of us who were able to work from home to see the kind of like death knell to any separation between the home and work. If there was already a kind of deteriorating border between the two, as more people over the last decade started working from home, thanks to telecommunications networks and other technologies, this has been kind of dramatically exacerbated, where now you have bosses suspicious of you because the home itself signifies leisure, so they almost don't believe that you're working full time, so you're working extra time. It becomes this kind of nonstop work within a space that has no distinctions between work and leisure. However, that said, to qualify that as new would be a kind of it would be false, because historically the home has always been a space that where leisure and work cohabitated, except for a very small blip within the historical record, which one we could call the modern distinction between the two. Likewise, for the kind of sense that the home as a new site of labor for many of us, the us there is probably just people like me, men, 50% of the world, who doesn't really participate in housework as much as the other 50% of the world, for whom the home has always been intimately a site of labor. So I'll actually hand it off now to Victoria, who will kind of pick up further on the kind of questionableness of the sense of the new.
Yeah, so as Nick sort of delved into the trigger word of the interior, the thing that was getting me down, in fact, was this use of the new, which was a fascination initially just in the way we were narrating COVID, which was framed in every journal article in several languages. I don't know how it was in Russian, but as the novel coronavirus. And I understand that that's something that we use the term novel to talk about viruses that are new. However, the term, I found it quite trivializing. So rather than saying the coronavirus, which we do not know very much about, or which we do not yet understand, or which we have not seen before and don't know what it's going to do, novel kind of gave it this this sort of lightness, almost as though it was a curiosity. When something is novel in plain speech, it is sort of a light new discovery. It's not an earth-shaking moment, typically. And of course, this is just a very atmospheric parallel, but also novel is a work of fiction in the English language. And there is this sort of storytelling element. And the whole narration, again, around these terms was quite difficult to penetrate in terms of what was real, what was merely a story or a theory. I mean, speaking of this vocabulary of anxiety too, or the state of anxiety, I would say that was a very stressful, I think, for a lot of people, because of this newness, and things like novel and so on seem to sort of soften it deliberately, while perhaps sort of not really addressing what was going on. And then the other sort of thing that I found quite problematic as we began to talk about what would happen, quote unquote, after coronavirus, or in whatever next phase there was this idea of the new normal. And the new normal, what was it going to be? That was a major sort of speculation. But of course, now many of us are experiencing this next phase, and certainly in Germany, the new normal looks a hell of a lot like what everything we were doing before. And to leave the problematic term normal aside, which is already kind of a lot, and already, to me, not desirable after such a shattering pandemic, or during one, I would say. The idea of normalcy just seems to completely ignore a world of truths that have to do with people dying and so on. So the new normal also seems like a bit of a stretch. And also it just doesn't seem particularly new. And I began to think about the way that we just talk about things being new in general, and realized that this is clearly not the first time we've put new in front of something that in fact never changed, or neo in front of something that in fact never went away. I read a quote by Achille Bembe, who's a theorist who discusses, among other things, decolonial matters. He framed the new, and this is in a post-colonial context, not a COVID one, as a mask that covers up old racial orders. So obviously, not just in the context of COVID, but also in the context of racial injustice, the idea of the new seems very toxic. In fact, it seems like a lie. It seems like a tool that can be deployed on the part of existing structures and systems to sort of rebrand something that is actually staying, to rebrand the status quo that hasn't gone anywhere and that we have no intention of getting rid of. So, for example, when we talk about neoclassicism, there's some kind of implication that, you know, there was a point at which that somehow was not a desirable institutional architectural format, for example. When we talk about neo-fascism or neo-Nazis, it sort of asserts that there was a time when the world was completely purged of that, which of course is not the case. So the new, this idea of the new and the language of the new is seemingly a convenience that we can use to simply say one thing while actually continuing another. So with following the civil rights movement in the States in the 60s, which was kind of in parallel with the seemingly oblivious whole catalog crew, when that sort of concluded, it was as though we just said we have a new system now and we're not racist anymore, and that kind of veneer of newness and change has been revealed to be precisely that, which a veneer, something that you just put on top of something. In this case, this new. So of course, we use it in media all the time. I mean, we're constantly talking about the new, not just the new normal, but the new version of whatever. It's a very common headline, which seems to be so cavalier that it's become completely devoid of meaning. And in fact, the new, if anything, seems to preclude what it promises. It seems to prevent whatever kind of newness is suggested in the terminology. First of all, it always precedes an existing word or an existing concept. So it's like somehow tied to maintenance. And this also speaks to some of the language we encountered and had issues with around environmental crisis, which is the language of sustainability. And talking about, this is really the flip side of the coin of the new normal, but talking about sustainability in a context of utter crisis seemed really insufficient to us, much like that image of the globe did, because the idea is actually that we must change things, ideally very radically, if we're going to sort of stop them in their tracks or at least adapt in an adequate way. So this is sort of just a sketch that I put out there, and it's sort of something that we've been talking about and thinking about, that sort of serves to problematize maybe just the language we've used, but also maybe the framework with which we approached the dossier, and also, I would say, how the latest discourse of the past several months has impacted how we're thinking about the issues that the dossier addresses and how they're addressed within it. And sort of the exercise that we sort of took on when we were composing Black Hole Catalog was to highlight and feel out some of the cognitive dissonances or some of the inherent contradictions into the way that these global issues that really were and still are pulling people together in a sense, or at least into dialogue, that still imbue the way we talk about climate injustice and racial injustice, the way we talk about inequality, and the types of actions we take on in order to address those things, and the mixed messaging and conflicting instructions often that when we composed the dossier, we were sort of approaching from the climate stance alone, but that seemed to have applications within within both the pandemics of systemic racism and of COVID-19. One of the really main ones being this kind of seeming tension between individual and collective in terms of responsibility and action. So on that note, I I think maybe you could put us both on screen if that's possible, and we could invite the audience to participate if they have any questions or comments.
Yes, right. Thank you very much, Victoria and Nicholas. We do have a bunch of questions, so I'll start with them. Today, since the lockdown happened to many countries, people feel locked not only in their homes, but in the internet thinking and the screen time. Therefore, a lot of educational entertainment and all sorts of content was produced enormously. And what do you think of this overproduction and so-called internet fatigue? And do you think that high rates of information anxiety and depression today can be linked to the way large capitalist platforms use attention as a new kind of asset?
I can go. Completely. I think that along the kind of lines in which I was discussing work in general, one of the kind of the kind of cues of this new affective structure, which I think of primarily through exhaustion as the kind of primary measure of it, that comes from a kind of a lack of a differentiation between the various both physical spaces, as I was saying, the interior spaces that one used to have an office versus your bedroom, now they're the same. But also I think of the interfaces as well, the digital interfaces. So when you're just literally looking at a screen from 8 a.m. till 11 p.m. for everything from your work to your love life, to your friends, to your family, it can be quite overwhelming, I think. And in fact, if you actually look at the structure, like an independent kind of research trajectory I've been conducting for a while, I've been looking at the technology of a webcam, and really as an innovation, as a technological innovation, the innovative quality doesn't lie in its photographic, in kind of in the photo technologies, but rather it's really a work technology. It was designed by a bunch of programmers at Cambridge in the 90s in order to speed up their workflow by having a kind of feed into a coffee pot in another room so they can see if the coffee pot was full or empty, and therefore not waste time go to an empty pot. So like throughout the kind of fundamental structure, I think of a lot of the interfaces and technologies we're using right now have to be understood as technologies of labor, and as such are effective technologies of labor, but part of the kind of effect of that, the wearing and tearing of machines, as Marx says, is that we have become part of that machine, that the kind of loss of value for us is from that kind of exhaustion. And going off the kind of last point about like us as the kind of relation that has to let's say the kind of conversion of clicks to capital, I do think that kind of takes a similar toll. To be extracted as a resource, we know from labor, we know from a lot of labor discourses, produces a kind of deleterious effect. But the same thing I think happens when your very time and attention has become a commodity as well. To become fracked for that, I think is quite debilitating.
I want to flag up the sort of flipped side of that too, which is related. I mean, in terms of how people have been consuming on lockdown, there were some images that were quite well circulated. For example, I believe it was a subway station in Milan, where there was absolutely no one there. Of course, there was quite a strict lockdown, but it was just absolutely full of people wearing delivery service uniforms with bikes, with the food delivery service kind of big box things, and absolutely 100% people of color. And those are the people that are being asked, as you say, to go out into this world in a city where it's very, very high infection rates, and to have to leave the interior like the proverbial like wartime postman to respond to all of these orders and all of these perceived needs or even whims of people who are able to sit at home and not just give their attention to content and so on, but also give their money to these firms that then sort of mobilize these workforces that are fundamentally at risk. So to every person at home participating in a screen, there's somebody on the other side, I suppose, that is out there too.
Thank you on your comment. And the next question is actually a little bit following your thought from the talk. You've mentioned state reacting to the pandemic. So the question is, what do you think of the regulations many governments introduced? Are they bringing us closer to the decay or discreditation of capitalism, or is it a fiction?
I think we have a lot of thoughts on some of these restrictions. I mean, for me, one of the effects of the restriction and people's response to it has been really to highlight or unveil so much about how we identify how we identify with or respond to authority, and of course also all of the chains of labor and production and so on that were revealed within that, the individuals versus the sort of governing entity. The whole new relationship to that, I think, was highlighted in terms of it kind of putting an end to it. I don't know, but it does certainly seem like there's a lot more clarity in terms of the sort of global capitalist systems. My fear now is less one of a pandemic, but more one of these newly revealed systems being forgotten very quickly. I don't know if Nick, you want to add anything to that?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't. Is COVID the crisis that will finally end capitalism? I don't know. It'd be nice, but I rather doubt it. It's proved pretty resilient in the past. However, I do think if you were to ask me like 6 weeks ago if I would have ever been able to imagine prison abolition becoming a mainstream topic within American discourse, it would have seemed as impossible as the revolution, like, right, the kind of prophetic, like kind of messianic revolution. So in that sense, I feel like my presumptions and my kind of cynicism has been in many ways shattered, less by COVID than by the kind of uprising in reaction to the murder of George Floyd. But that said, I mean, yeah, what I think echoing what Victoria says, what is certainly clear is that there's been an exposition or kind of an inability to look away from these contradictions that are inherent to capitalism, contemporary capitalism, and that have been exacerbated in many cases by the pandemic, or simply kind of excavated for audiences who weren't so privy to them. To me, it does seem like some of these contradictions are completely incompatible. I mean, what you see is really the kind of the biopolitical state functioning very poorly. It's not really regulating who lives and who dies with much efficacy. Or one could say maybe it is. Maybe if you look at the kind of the death tolls, who is dying, maybe one could say it actually is quite very much doing what it wants to do, what it was designed to do. But what I think is interesting is kind of like after generations, decades of seeing a kind of like a kind of increasingly granular biopolitical apparatus, one that operates on an increasingly granular scale, to then when kind of the crisis emerged in this kind of in unprecedented rapidity. And that is the thing. I mean, nobody really expected the pandemic to spread so quickly. Globalization, like, it really kind of showed just how globalized, how interior we are to all of this. The response was a very non-granular response. It was a one-size-fit-all response, and so that to me is interesting to see the kind of like biopolitical state, which had seemed totalizing in its capacities, in its ability to turn us into a kind of extractable sources of capital, to the point where even our laughter, our masturbation is a source of profit for capital, for corporations. There is a kind of sense of its frailty that was exposed, and I think that is something that should be leveraged and seized upon by political actors.
Just to add, and maybe to tie the two past questions together, I mean, I think one of the dangers is if the goal is some kind of actual change, things like the notion of the new normal and the way that's been mediatized are dangerous to that end. That is how we don't get anything done, is by reframing things with this sort of, novel framework, this new normal. That's exactly how we go right back to the same systems, all the while talking about it as though we've actually eliminated them. And I think that's a really, really big danger. And the other one being, which is mentioned in the previous comment as well, being this sort of idea of burnout. We all got Zoom fatigue 2 weeks into quarantine. I think that was very real. And now really only do it for professional reasons, more than other ones. And the news cycle burnout also. COVID cases are still multiplying with wildly rapid rates. Granted, there has been other global news items, namely these protests, that have eclipsed them, and they've certainly eclipsed my obsessive news reading about Corona, because now I'm obsessively reading about legislation and protests and so forth. But you can already see the burnout happening in that respect as well. And the idea of sustaining these conversations seems quite daunting to a lot of people, I believe. And specifically when they're being told that we actually have entered some kind of different world or different phase within the world. That's my that's my personal terror at the moment, or if you want to call it neophobic. But I don't fear the new. I fear the lie of the new.
Right. I mean, because if this is a new world that we've looked at, its defining features, if you ignore the glittering screens, which we tend to only have a mono focus on, the other defining characteristics where you have a kind of radical and kind of vicious separation of social classes between those who are exposed and the wealthy elite who can shelter away. I mean, that's just the plot of the Decameron. So there's nothing new really here going on.
But also to add, regarding the threat of globalism, the discourse that is coming up in some areas and not others is a colonial one. Like even this sort of framework around the new is quite colonial. The new world is this territory that we're going to land on and build something new. Actually, what we're going to do is just bring a Protestant value system that's highly individualistic and just implant it here from the old world. And
with diseases.
Well, exactly, and that colonial behavior is also being highlighted in the COVID crisis, because what you have is extremely global, extremely mobile people, businesses, and systems that are without accountability, importing things. And I mean, that's another kind of sort of friction, I think, that we're all kind of grappling with, is the closing and the opening of borders specifically, more than the kind of internal sanctions, which have repercussions in that discourse. If you're pro safety, you want the borders shut, but you don't want the borders shut. That's not the world we grew up in. We grew up in a one of being able to travel, being able to be global. And what is the relationship to that sort of self-identity of globalism to the colonial framework that is violent, and that plays out both in with COVID and with racial violence.
I think you kind of saw the ridiculousness, or the kind of the cynicality of the state in full force with the curfews that were implemented in the United States right after the quarantine. So I returned to Los Angeles a few weeks ago, and as soon as I landed, there was like 5 alerts on my phone about these curfews that were enforced throughout the county and city and state. Those were, of course, just really a means to criminalize anyone who was on the street, who was involved in protests. They were taken down a few days later after they proved incredibly non-effective to stem protests. But one of the things I think was interesting is if you did respect the curfew, then all you were doing was spending your time watching essentially snuff films of the police brutalizing its citizens. And again, we're speaking, we're both Americans, so we're speaking very deeply to an American context, but it's also one that's fundamentally global. And I imagine everyone who's watching this has seen many of these videos as well. And that's quite different than I think the digital fatigue of reading about Corona or the digital fatigue of being on TikTok. It's something happening on a very intense level with intense repercussions, I think.
And it is the reason that it also feels like it plugs into what we're approaching here is that with the climate strikes and then with COVID on this incredibly massive level, and again with these protests, I mean, it's never happened before that this many countries and cities have participated in this type of protest and to pick it up so quickly and for it to be so, I mean, it's relatively mainstream. In that sense, that it feels like I don't know whether it was we were primed for global action because of Corona. There was this sense of like suddenly what was happening in Budapest was maybe relevant to you because maybe they'd done something really smart there in terms of quarantine, or maybe they had a strange infection story or something. And I wonder if that's also part of what we're seeing. And then, of course, the easy answer is again, to speak to the first question, is the availability of the international news, which whether or not it's not on these platforms, but which is available without pre-selection or editing, obviously on social media. But do we want to maybe take another one because we've been going on a little bit?
Sure. Thank you for the very profound and honest answers. And we actually are receiving much more questions regarding the new normal, as you named it. And how do you think the consumption will change after pandemic? It will be the same, or will face kind of a new world? And following this question, actually, the next question is kind of not from this one. Also, how do you think media will change in the following years? How magazines will face new society needs?
I'll let Victoria handle the magazine part. In terms of consumption, I think it is really remarkable to see how dramatic. I mean, it became a kind of cliche, and also I think was something that was deployed by kind of, let's say, eco-fascist sentiments. Was the kind of looking at how the kind of remarkability of how radically our carbon emissions went down, and how actually quickly certain ecosystems were able to spring back from just a slight pause in our consumptive and exhaustive kind of presence. That said, it looks like it's just starting right back up. So if anything, I mean, I think it will start right up. I don't think we're going to go from this into like a nice stack period. I mean, I think certain states will take advantage of that. I think you see that's happening in New Zealand. I think you see it happening in other places where they're taking this as an opportunity to not go back to the old normal, let's say. But at the same time, I don't think that will be the case in the United States or Great Britain or many of the kind of dominant economies right now under the leadership in which they're under. That said, though, I think what is amazing in terms of the kind of collective, in terms of us as humans, as non-policy makers, for the most part, is at least the kind of awakening of an imagination. If it felt impossible for us to ever pull back from the kind of the carbon-heavy lifestyle which we were leading, well, it proves that we can, and we did. And if anything, that occasions at least the possibility of hope in a future.
Anecdotally, I would say that consumption and certainly like the way things were advertised and what was advertised, that I noted really a return to this kind of whole earth catalog type of consumption. There's like a survivalist impulse, which is obviously in the air beforehand with climate change, that sort of accelerated. I think even personally, like I bought mason jars and I made kvass at home. I've never done anything like that in my life. And I'm a bit mortified to say that I did, but so this kind of like DIY thing when you're in home by yourself all the time is of course naturally the way you're going to go. In terms of consumption of content, obviously the market for content is huge right now, as some of the people asking questions have noticed, and it's because they know where we are, right? I mean, they know everyone's, and also as businesses kind of change their strategies and change their sales strategies, they need language for that. Anecdotally, what I've witnessed just in my own professional sphere, I have colleagues and collaborators and friends who work in content, so writers, editors, getting book deals, getting headhunted. There's also a lot of, just from the professional side of things, first because of COVID and then because of this sort of media purge that's happened in the States with editors resigning and so on. There's a lot of talent circulating right now. We're going to see new platforms being built, I think. I hope, to join Nick on the hopeful front, I hope that the way those platforms will be set up will be in ways that allow for underrepresentation to be made up for a redistribution of capital within media. And as I say, kind of a bit of getting rid of some old norms and getting rid of some things that had been ignored for a long time. I do think that will see the demise of a certain of a number of content platforms, and I also do sort of wonder what niches will step into the foreground as being really relevant. Classical, like traditional arts coverage to me does not seem like a real urgent necessity in this environment. Obviously, social, political, and broad cultural phenomenon will be in great demand editorially, but also the way that brands and the way that people selling things are going to start using content platforms, I believe, will also shift. And we were already seeing things like galleries and stuff with content platforms hiring heads of content and so on, and brands as well. Retail platforms with an editorial department, for example. And I really sense that in this kind of remote capitalist framework, that will be an industry in which the industry of content, which we don't even really refer to that often in those terms, like as a commodity in and of itself. I think that that's kind of a product market that I see expanding and I see changing because of consumer demand.
You're right. I guess we will see how it goes. And we have a little bit abstract questions. One of them is, so instead of word novel, what would be a more appropriate word to use? Not just like a novel coronavirus, but in a sense of the new normal, novel normal, and so on. What would you suggest as writers?
I've been calling it phase 2. Because either the neutrality of the numbers, and because I don't have other language. I've thought of this myself. I've asked myself this question. Because of course and thank you for asking it, because in that presentation of this sort of lie of the new is actually something I've been writing as well, and I stopped before offering a solution. I think that it's so it's so, to Nick's point, like this idea of like maybe the current moment is like a way of stoking the imagination, if not actual kind of reality. We need a completely different vocabulary, I think. That's not just visual too, that's verbal. Like the way we talk about things perpetuates all the stuff that we're trying to shake completely. Like we're just, I'm so aware of it now that I'm sort of editing in my head, editing Instagram posts I read, like, oh, it's a contradiction. or editing myself, and like we just did, you know, we edited our own dossier. We were like, the interior means something else now, and also we can't call it new. So yeah, and I don't know what our lives look like outside of those frameworks, but we're going to need, forgive me for saying, we're going to need new language. Right. But actually new. Or we're going to need to potentially, I suppose the other solution is get rid of all the stuff that we're accompanying with the new. So like, how do we actually archive colonialism? How do we actually archive fascism? How do we actually archive those frameworks and let their alternatives actually emerge? And we don't need the word new.
Right. I think the new normal as a term, as it's being used right now in mass media, is quite interesting, because I mean, having worked for a number of publications in the past, varying degrees of kind of, let's say, turnaround, that there's a kind of tendency within contemporary media, particularly online media, to term things in such a way, to kind of bundle things. There's a economic logic to it, a marketing logic to terms like the new normal. It's a lot sexier and catchier than saying, oh, it's interesting how during quarantine we've had kind of return to pre-modern forms of dwelling. Like, that's not such a sexy headline. So part of it is the way in which media operates, and the kind of clickbait attitudes of it, that kind of produce these inclinations or encourage them. But on the other hand, there's also, I think, these are kind of enmeshed factors, as Victoria was saying. The new normal is itself, like the two phonemes are technology, and they're deployed for strategic means. And so as much as it's not a catchy headline, a kind of accurate description of how we're re-inhabiting prior forms of, or like existing social structures, we're kind of reinvesting in old ones, and in their maintenance. It might not be, like the kind of like the maintained normal is not as, maybe the maintained normal. What about that one, Victoria?
It would be accurate, I think. I mean,
the incessant normal, the unchanging and enduring normal.
Relentless, all engrossing normal. I mean, I think also the way we talk about innovation, to use sort of a language from the tech industry and so on, innovation is really presenting something as new. Like to innovate is actually to tell the story of something in a way that makes the something seem new, which is a degree of removal from actual introduction of previously unseen things. So the new is this kind of, speaking of Boccaccio, I think novels even first used in reference, like vocabulary-wise, it's first used in reference to the Decameron, which was issued in a sequence. So this is a plague memoir that was sort of serialized initially before it was compiled into the work we know it into today. And so we were calling each little section novel because it was it had just been just been written. And the idea of the new being a framework or a story, which actually even ties into the way we talk about news now, right? Like we literally, if it's not paired with bad, it's paired with fake. This idea of this kind of the unreliability of the news also, and the unreliability of the reports coming about what is going on that is recent. So there's even, I suppose, to that degree, sort of an acknowledgement within the mainstream discourse of this problem with new But yeah, of course, it's also, I mean, from a media perspective, like we throw that term around all the time in headlines, and as you say, it's just because it's got a nice ring to it. But I do think that as people who make content, and as brands who use messaging, as any messaging, that also applies to governments and states and political bodies, the language you use like enforces these things. These terms and these frameworks serve a purpose of maintaining order or maintaining a status quo or moving capital around in certain ways. So I think paying attention to them isn't about getting obsessed with like the word new and being triggered by it. It's also about using language and also using imaging as sort of to get to the nature of the problem, which is kind of the methodology we applied with the black hole catalog and switching out the Earth image with the black hole, and in switching out the title to something a bit more fearsome and trappy, is that these vocabularies do reinforce the way people look at things in the media and content at large. Now that news is kind of like journalism sort of out of the picture, and you just have content, unreliable marketing content. The way these languages are used within those frameworks is super important to keep an eye on.
And just going off, picking up off what you just said, I think what is kind of, if there's again a hopeful edge to this lexical trap, would be that words are not immutable, that they're in fact highly mutable, that they're constantly changing. And I don't think it's so much a question of swapping one for another as much as shifting the valence in which they're received, which comes with what you write afterwards. And to that end, one of the kind of important strategies, like with the kind of swapping out of the title and the photo of the catalog, something I think we're both quite interested in, is the possibility of using terms, but in a kind of under erasure, to put them under pressure. So what we did today was to kind of look back on our own use of the terms in like a very recent historical document. But also within the project, we already were kind of, I think we were already understanding the words as we were stretching them to the limits of their feasibility. It's not necessarily a question of individual words as much as we like to talk about them very much, the two of us, as much as it is about where the words sit in a sentence, in a paragraph.
And continuing the idea of content, producing it, and actually journalism, I would like to maybe sneak peek to our audience our next joint event with Victoria and Nicholas, and maybe you could just tell a bit more about it. So we do plan to conduct a workshop on the black hole catalog and beyond it. So could you just tell more what is the idea of the workshop and how you plan to do it? Just we are not sure yet whether it will be online or offline later in August or September, whenever it's will be possible. But still, with different media of communications, we are planning to do it. So can you just sprinkle a little bit of details?
Sorry.
So I think we viewed this presentation as the formation of how we're going to operate the workshop based on the feedback that we get and the questions that were asked and the themes that stick. That's what's interesting about what Nick just referred to as this sort of accelerated historical approach, is we could now leverage the work that we did in 2019 as a way of getting as a way of sort of getting at the broader topics, engaged in it, and also now that we've sort of presented it to you in the new context of the new cycles and discourse we're talking about, what's interesting is that we get to see what, effectively what sticks and how a discourse around it can kind of build on it. So our intention is to use the questions, and I understand that more will come in later, as a stimulus for an expansion of the concept and potentially even an expansion of the vocabulary that was just interrogated, that could be somehow beneficial in the ways that we do talk about climate change and climate disaster, and also issues of globalism and so on and so forth.
Right, and one of the kind of nice things in borrowing the format of the Whole Earth catalog is there's a presumption of seriality, actually novelty, that comes with that format, and the way we presented it, the original cover, it has an issue number effectively, and so there's a kind of it sets up a kind of presumption of seriality. But what we're really interested in is to essentially make another issue collaboratively with this kind of Strelka workshop that can be as far distant away from our first one as it feels appropriate. I mean, already we feel like it was a very distant object, and it's been only a matter of about 6 months since it came out. And so we're interested to see how much more distance kind of erupts in the next 2 months or so before the workshop happens, and these questions were asked. But also what's great is, so the original Whole Earth catalog was compiled collectively by its editors, who are kind of there is the big names of Stuart Brand and Justin McGurk and others, but there's also this kind of anonymous crowd of editors, of contributors, and something that's really what we're interested in is very much the catalog section, the end part of. If you actually get an issue, you can see it's divided into, there's an introductory setup, and then there's the catalog itself, which we showed you some slides of. And so compiling that, what are useful resources? What does it mean what are the kind of, let's say, commodified objects, like not necessarily for sale, but like they are consumable objects that can be, that are, appropriate to creating a kind of new framework to understand this unfolding contemporary as we live in it. So I think the things that we chose 6 months ago, a lot of them may not necessarily be the right ones now. And so we'd be interested to see what other people, what we could collectively form, what would be the resources that feel like the best way to image ecology right now.
So yeah, the tool, basically, the idea is to define the tools and collaboratively. So the tools being, the imagery and the language, but also the actual tools, the PDFs and so on. And it's interesting, actually, that that recently, particularly following George Floyd and the protests that ensued, all of these reading lists are circulating. People are putting PDFs online. There's a big move to do self-education, which is also kind of a Whole Earth catalog ethos, even though topically it's very different. So the methodology of these kinds of like crowdsourced DIY compilations as toolkits seems valuable and also feasible in the event that the course is digitized. We'll simply consume and source things out the old Corona way, digitally. And then, of course, if things materialize IRL, that can add another element of this so-called building, or rather interior designing, that can kind of parlay into episode 2 of the catalog.
So I do encourage everybody who's watching us now and will watch later to react and feedback on the talk. Please do it wherever you like, and later we will post an announcement about the workshop. So please stay tuned. So that I think that our time is coming to end, and if you have anything that you would like to say as a farewell to the audience, please do.
Just thank you for your questions. It's really nice to have that level of engagement with these talks, particularly when some of them is just talking at a screen. So thank you for being out there. And thank you to everyone at Strelka for having us.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nicholas and Victoria. The talk will be available on our Strelka YouTube, Facebook, and Contacte. So please follow our future announcement at strelka.com, and have a great end of the week. Bye, everyone.